My name is Margaret, and at 66 years old, I thought I had seen enough hardship in life to withstand almost anything. I had built my world with calloused hands and a determined heart, raising my only daughter Grace, with everything I had, often sacrificing my own needs so she could have more. Yet one ordinary afternoon, a simple sound on my phone would unravel decades of devotion in a matter of minutes. The ping of a voice message arriving had seemed so harmless. I had been stirring chamomile tea, trying to calm the unease that had been growing inside me ever since Grace and her husband Richard had moved into my home. I thought the message would be some small reminder or a kind word. But when I pressed play, what poured into my ears was a dagger sharpened by betrayal and laughter. "Ricardo, I can't take having my mother in this house anymore." Grace's voice carried a coldness that froze my blood. "She's a nuisance. She gets into everything, and on top of that, we're already spending so much money on her. I've been looking into some cheap places. I found one that only costs $800 a month." The words tumbled on every syllable, striking like a whip. My daughter, the child I had raised with sleepless nights and endless sacrifices, was speaking about me as though I were unwanted clutter. I gripped the edge of the counter, my legs trembling beneath me. But the next part was worse, cutting deeper than anything I could have imagined. I already checked the house papers. It's in her name, but I found a way to transfer it to our name without her realizing. "Carol's going to help me." And then came her laughter, light and cruel. "In a month, Mom will be in the home and will own everything. We can finally live in peace without that bitter old woman controlling us." The room spun around me. I sat on the kitchen floor, phone still in my hand, listening again and again, hoping I had misunderstood. But no, the words were there, undeniable and clear. My only daughter, my Grace, was plotting not only to discard me into a nursing facility, but to steal the house I had built brick by brick. That house was more than wood and mortar. It was 30 years of labor, 12-hour days, cleaning other people's homes, every scraped dollar saved every holiday worked. It was where Grace had taken her first steps, where my mother had sung lullabies to her granddaughter, where every photograph on the walls told a story of survival and hope. And now Grace wanted it stripped from me as though it meant nothing. I could not sleep that night. I wandered from room to room, touching the walls as though saying goodbye. Every corner whispered memories, from Grace's laughter on her 15th birthday to the evenings I stayed up late ironing her uniforms. Betrayal echoed louder than memory, twisting my stomach until I thought I might break apart. But in that darkest night, something else began to stir inside me, a steeliness that had always been there, buried beneath years of sacrifice and silence. Grace thought I was weak, naive, too old to see through her schemes. She had forgotten who I was. I was the woman who had carried her on my back when we couldn't afford a bus. I was the woman who had sold my jewelry to buy her books. I was the woman who had convinced her fiancé to return after he left her once. I had built my life on resilience, and now I would use that resilience to defend myself. To understand why it hurt so much, you must know how my life had been shaped. I grew up in a home where sacrifice was the definition of love. My mother, a seamstress who worked from dawn until long past dusk, taught me that for family, you give everything down to your last drop of blood. When I found myself pregnant at 18, abandoned by a man whose family slammed the door in my face, my mother embraced me and said, "That child is going to have everything we couldn't. We'll raise her together." She sold the only jewelry she owned to buy what I needed for the baby, and when Grace was born, I thought an angel had entered my life. Her smile was my salvation, her tiny hands my anchor. I was just 19 when I began cleaning houses, earning barely $20 a day. Every penny went to Grace. I still remember her first day of kindergarten. We walked because bus fare was too much, but she wore her uniform crisp and spotless shoes, polished hair tied neatly. The other mothers arrived in shiny cars with manicured nails. I stood in my patched dress hands, rough and cracked, but when Grace kissed me and whispered, "You're the best mom in the world," I felt richer than all of them. My mother passed when Grace was 8, leaving me with her final words etched into my soul. "That child is your greatest treasure. Give her an education. Give her love. She will take care of you when you are old. Our blood is good. She won't fail you." Those words carried me through decades of toil. I scrubbed floors, laundered clothes, cooked meals for families who barely acknowledged me, all to keep Grace moving forward. When she turned 15, I spent $3,500 money meant to repair our leaking roof on a party that made her feel like royalty. When it was time for college, I signed a loan using my house as collateral, sold the last jewelry I owned, even parted with my mother's sewing machine to cover the $15,000 a year tuition. I told Grace she would never clean houses like I did. She would work in an office respected and comfortable. Watching her sign her enrollment papers, I cried with pride. 4 years passed in a blur of labor and sacrifice. I lived on beans and tortillas for weeks at a time so she could have new clothes for presentations. I accepted more work even on Sundays so she could join trips with classmates. When she graduated, cap and gown on her shoulders, tears streaming down her face as she said, "This is as much yours as mine," I thought every sacrifice had been worth it. She promised me then that I would never suffer again. When she met Richard, I welcomed him like a son, and when they married, I spent $10,000 on the wedding she wanted. She said she would take care of me now. For a while, I believed it. The years that followed began with hope. They visited often, we shared meals, and she helped with groceries. But when Richard lost his job, they started asking for money. First $1,000, then $2,500 for a car, then $3,000 for debts. I gave without question. But slowly, the warmth faded. Phone calls became short, then infrequent. Invitations to gatherings stopped. When I did see them, Grace began dropping hints about my forgetfulness, my age, her concern that I couldn't live alone. She framed it as care, but the seed of doubt was planted. Then came the day they asked to stay in my house while their apartment was painted. I thought it was a chance to grow close again. Instead, it became the beginning of my imprisonment. Richard criticized everything: my old TV, the water pressure, the internet speed. Grace rearranged my cupboards, donated my clothes, treated my belongings like clutter. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. I overheard Richard on the phone saying I didn't suspect a thing, that Carol would have the papers ready soon. They even began handling my bills, going through my bank statements, questioning my expenses. Visitors came, uninvited doctors and social workers arranged by Grace, writing reports that suggested I was confused. Lies spread even to friends. Grace told my oldest companion that I had tried to go for a walk at night, believing it was morning. I felt myself disappearing, my autonomy stolen, with a smile. And then that fateful afternoon, the voice message shattered any illusions left. The full extent of their scheme unfolded in my kitchen. Not only did they plan to transfer my house into their names with forged documents they had already arranged with a care home to admit me under false claims of dementia. They laughed about how they would trick me with a fake appointment and how my life insurance in their name would benefit them if something happened to me. They calculated my death as casually as they planned a vacation. The woman I had carried, fed, clothed, and loved with every fiber of my being was plotting to erase me entirely. But they had made one mistake. Grace thought I was too old, too naive, too blinded by love to fight back. She forgot who raised her. She forgot the blood in my veins was the same as my mother's, a woman who worked from dawn to midnight and still stood tall. That night, I cried yes, but by dawn, I stood straighter than I had in years. I dressed in my crimson suit, the same one I wore to her college graduation, and placed my pearl earrings in my ears. I gathered every important document, tucked them into my purse, and left a note on the table. I had business to attend to. What Grace did not know was that her plan had already failed because I had decided to fight with every ounce of strength I had left. I arrived at the bank just as the doors unlocked, the air still smelling of disinfectant and printer toner, and asked for the manager who had watched me deposit small, hard-earned sums for more than a decade. She greeted me with the politeness reserved for loyal customers, but her expression shifted when I requested every transaction from the past 6 months, a beneficiary change for my life insurance, and the revocation of any third-party access. When she mentioned a letter authorizing Grace to review my accounts, my letter allegedly signed by me, I asked to see it and felt no surprise, only a cold, clarifying anger when the signature slanted in a way my hand had never learned. The manager compared it to my ID and winced, then placed a fraud alert on my accounts, closed the old ones, opened new ones, and watched me reclaim the small island of my savings like a woman returning to her homeland after a long occupation. I left with new passwords, new account numbers, and a printout of every unauthorized withdrawal, each entry like a scratch on a door that someone had tried to pry open. From the bank, I walked to the county office where Carol, the cousin with the bright smile and quiet talent for erasing boundaries, worked behind a desk stacked with files. I asked about routine updates my daughter had mentioned and kept my tone soft, as if inquiring about the weather, while a tiny recorder hummed in my purse. The facade crumbled as soon as I set my phone on the counter and mentioned that I had heard everything. Her hands, pretty and manicured, started to shake. Between bursts of tears, she unfolded the scheme in precise, guilty detail, how the bogus medical notes had been procured, how signatures had been traced and notarized by a man who should have known better, how the petition for guardianship would be filed the same day I was delivered to a care facility under the pretense of a routine checkup. I didn't threaten. I offered choices. Help me invalidate every paper you fabricated and give me copies, or I take this to your supervisor, and then the police and the full weight of your helpfulness will land where it belongs. She chose the path with fewer ledgers and more mercy-faxed withdrawals of filings, stamped cancellations, and handed me a folder that felt heavier than its pages. A ledger of betrayal itemized in legalese. Then I went to a lawyer, with a spine like a plumb line and eyes that looked at evidence the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. He read silently for a long time, the clock murmuring on the wall, and when he finished, he clasped his hands, not in prayer, but in strategy. We would pursue both civil and criminal routes. He explained, the first to recover losses and erect fences, the second to ensure the lesson etched itself deeply into the habit of certain hearts. We would schedule an evaluation by an independent geriatric specialist to cement my mental competence and use the fresh report as a bright lantern against forged shadows. We would alert the bank formally. We would gather statements, notarize transcripts of the voice message, and prepare an injunction strong enough to halt reckless hands from touching my title deed again. He asked what outcome I wanted beyond law and paper. I told him I wanted the truth to stand up in my living room and refuse to be seated ever again. I returned home at dusk with the sky the color of old copper and found my house neat in the way of stage sets. Cushions plumped counters, wiped everything gleaming as if cleanliness could absolve the dirt of intent. Grace's smile, when she asked how my errands had gone, was sweetened with syrup. She had learned to pour on anything unpalatable. I said only that visitors would be arriving in the morning, and thought how often I had muttered, "Make yourself at home to people who had no right to be comfortable in my life." That night, the house was quiet, though. Sleep still felt like a fragile bargain. I drifted in and out of light dreams, where documents unrolled like ribbons and then tied themselves into knots around the wrists of those who had written them. I woke ready, as if my body had remembered the countless mornings it had risen to work without complaint. And when the bell rang the next day, I met it with my shoulders square. The lawyer came first, then two officers who did not swagger or sneer, but moved through the doorway with the calm of people who intend to keep order merely by standing upright, and finally a notary who carried an old briefcase and the dignity of procedure. Grace and Richard entered the room with startled smiles that faltered when they saw badges. I asked them to sit. The lawyer unfolded the story like a map forged authorizations at the bank, the pattern of withdrawals, the cousin's sworn statement describing who had asked for what and when, the scheduled admission at the facility paid for in advance, the guardianship petition timed to spring like a trap on Tuesday next. He placed my new medical evaluation on the table last, the ink still fresh, its conclusion blunt and crystalline. No cognitive impairment, fully competent, independent in all instrumental activities. I pressed play on my phone, and my daughter's voice filled the room again, not as nightmare, but as evidence. She lunged for it, then froze when the officer's hand rose, not harshly, simply reminding her that boundaries existed and would be honored today, even if they had been trampled yesterday. The recording rolled on past the $800 home and the $500 bribe and the inventory of what my house would erase from their ledger of debts. When it reached the line about life insurance, a silence laid itself over the room so thick I thought even the air had turned away. I felt the ache of that moment, but also a clean clarity, the kind that arrives after storms scrub the horizon. The officers asked if I wished to proceed. I looked at my daughter's face and remembered how I had once learned to read her fevers from the heat of her forehead. Nothing in that skill prepared me for reading the coolness of her choices now. Yes, I said. They cuffed wrists that had fluffed my couch pillows and pointed at my fading curtain rods, and they let out the man who had once called me Mom. After I paid a mechanic's bill, he said he would repay a promise lost with others in the lint of their pockets. I did not rejoice. I stood quietly and watched the people who had turned me into a problem be treated like any other problem meets law. When the door closed, the house dropped into a silence that was not emptiness, but space a clearing where truth and air could move again. I made coffee and sat at the table, the grief arriving, as it always does after adrenaline has done its work. I cried for the child I had raised, who had not grown into the woman I thought I knew. I cried for my mother, whose trust in good blood had been a hope rather than a guarantee. I cried for the bruising realization that love is not a receipt book where past payments entitle us to future care. News travels through neighborhoods the way ivy takes offense quietly and then all at once. By evening, a neighbor came by with the soft questions of someone who had seen squad cars and wanted to offer comfort without asking for spectacle. I told her as much as I could bear to repeat, and she left soup and a loaf of bread, as if nourishment could paste together a heart. The next days were a choreography of necessary things: statements signed, copies certified a fraud claim, formalized with the bank, a protective order granted that barred attempts at contact, legal notices, filed so cleanly they felt like clean sheets. My lawyer made a habit of calling with updates, in a voice tempered by years of telling difficult truths. The cousin had resigned, then returned to give more names, which rolled outward into an investigation wider than my case, as systems built to help had corroded in places where no one had looked closely in too long. The backlash tried to arrive dressed as concern. Fake social profiles posted photographs stolen from family gatherings, captioned with pity for a confused old woman who had lashed out at the very hands that fed her. My phone collected voicemails that alternated between insults and sanctimony. Mercy and malice share a grammar when uttered by people who want to keep what they took. A pair of social workers I hadn't requested knocked at noon to check on my safety. I asked for identification and called the agency they named. No one had been sent. I shut the door gently and added a deadbolt to the list of purchases. When an anonymous letter arrived, suggesting I examine what I had done wrong to raise a daughter who despised me, I unfolded my mother's old letter and read the line I had nearly memorized. True love never seeks to destroy, never seeks to steal, never seeks to humiliate. I placed the anonymous paper beneath hers and saw one weighed nothing and the other held my life. Grace's lawyer reached out next with the shape of a compromise, the edges dulled to avoid a trial's glare. Return of the stolen funds, additional damages, and a promise to end their efforts and their noise if I would halt the criminal case. My attorney laid the offer before me like a plate. I asked for one more condition of public confession in the same places where they had spread lies, a notarized letter stating I was fully competent, that the reports they had shopped for were false, that they had planned to dispossess me and institutionalize me for their convenience. I wanted my name cleaned not only by law, but by the mouths that had stained it. They accepted perhaps because court is the worst mirror, and they were tired of seeing themselves. Money returned with the bland efficiency of a bank transfer, damages posted as numbers blinking into an account. It did not feel like victory, only like air after a long breath held underwater. But the confession black letters pinned to community boards and neighborhood feeds brought a quiet I had not thought possible. The whispers turned, if not into apologies, at least into a decency that knows when to be still. I turned to rebuilding in the ways that mattered, changing my will so that everything I owned would go one day to a foundation that helps elders who find themselves as I had found myself. Listing a condition that anyone who challenged the will would lose any right to sentimental keepsakes they might later claim to miss. Sorting my home room by room, not purging out of anger, but curating out of respect for the life I had lived inside it. The living room became mine again, not a place to perch, while younger voices measured my usefulness. The kitchen breathed. I cooked for myself and for friends who understand that sharing a table is a ceremony. The garden, which had wilted under the neglect of days spent defending my name, sent up new herbs as if hope were water. A few weeks later, I met my lawyer over coffee to sign final versions of papers that put fences where I needed fences. He smiled the way people do when storms have mostly passed and asked how I wanted to mark the end of the formal fight. I told him endings are just quiet thresholds. I would rather think in beginnings. And so, I began with a new apartment, smaller sunlit, a balcony that looked onto trees, and people my age walking slowly with purpose. I sold the house I had once thought I would die in, not to flee history, but to keep history from swallowing the present. I packed photographs of my mother and of a little girl whose eyes had once matched mine, placed them in a new living room, and decided that memory would be a lantern, not a chain. While boxes were still stacked like towers, a letter arrived from a government office whose business is taxes rather than tenderness. During discovery, my attorney had noticed contradictions in Richard and Grace's filings, incomes reported as fragile, while expenses strutted like peacocks. I had not asked for that stone to be turned, but once lifted, it revealed what happens when people teach themselves small thefts until larger ones seem reasonable. An audit bloomed. Numbers were recalculated. Penalties and interest grew like vines through their accounts. I did not celebrate. I simply understood, perhaps more than ever, that the world has ways of balancing ledgers we cannot always see. As summer folded its heat into softer evenings, I received a letter in a familiar hand. Not the quick defensive slant of a message scrawled to win an argument, but a careful, steady script that looked as if its writer had learned patience. Grace wrote that she was in therapy, that the therapist had not allowed her to hide behind the word desperation, that she had realized how easily she had come to treat me as a resource, a problem then, an obstacle. She did not ask for a meeting. She did not demand forgiveness. She wrote that understanding had arrived late, and would cost her everything it should. I sat with the letter a long time, feeling its weight and my own. I answered briefly that I wished her well, that forgiveness is not a bridge back to what once was, that my peace would be fragile if I handed its keeping to the same hands that had tried to take it. I sealed the envelope and felt something in me unclench, not triumph, but release. The life that grew after that was not theatrical. It was made of ordinary mornings where coffee tasted like permission of classes at the community center, where my feet learned to move to old songs of ours at a foundation where I helped other elders read their own papers and find their own voices. We reversed forged transfers, we accompanied people to banks, where they learned how to say no. We stood beside them when they told social workers what was true. I watched women my age step back into themselves like someone returning to a house after a long renovation, touching new walls, opening windows, recognizing their own furniture and bones. The work did not erase what had happened, but it braided meaning through it the way a gardener plants into soil turned by last season's storms. One autumn afternoon, I crossed paths with Grace at a shopping center, not because fate enjoys theater, but because cities are small, where lives have run long. She looked older than her years, and when she asked if the punishment had not gone on long enough, I told her I had never sought punishment, only consequence and safety. She cried. I did not. We stood like two women, separated by a doorway that could no longer be opened, and then we walked away. I went home to my balcony, listened to wind in the trees, and felt the strange, quiet gratitude that comes from surviving one's life and still finding it worthy. What I learned is not complicated, but it is hard, and it is this love without boundaries teaches others to ignore yours. Sacrifice offered without wisdom can become the script for your erasure, and dignity once reclaimed is a home no one else is allowed to redecorate. There is a tenderness available to us that is not sentimental. It is the tenderness of telling ourselves the truth and acting on it, of recognizing that blood is a map of origin, not a guarantee of destination. I have made a small, good life in the space that telling the truth opened for me. And in that life, I am not a nuisance, not an account to be accessed, not a door to be locked behind me in someone else's plan. I am a woman with a key that fits her own front door. The months following that encounter were quieter, though not without echoes. Word of what Grace and Richard had attempted spread beyond our neighborhood, printed in the local paper, under headlines about elder fraud and betrayal. Their names appeared alongside words like forgery conspiracy and guardianship abuse. Some people said justice had been served. Others whispered pity that a family could collapse so completely. But for me, it was neither shame nor triumph. It was simply the truth being set down where everyone could see it. I no longer had to carry the burden alone. I sold the house with its corridors of memories and moved into a smaller apartment where light streamed through wide windows and laughter from other residents echoed in the halls. It was the kind of place designed for seniors who still wanted independence but also community, and for the first time in years, I felt free to decorate a space without worrying someone would criticize the curtains or rearrange the plates. My neighbors welcomed me warmly, women and men who had endured their own stories of loss and resilience. They invited me to gardening clubs, to dance lessons, to simple afternoons of cards and conversation. Each invitation reminded me that life was not over simply because one chapter had ended in betrayal. I began to paint landscapes, something I had always admired, but never attempted. My brushstrokes were clumsy at first, but I found myself pouring into the canvas the emotions that words couldn't hold: anger, sorrow, but also peace and renewal. Soon, the walls of my apartment carried the colors of mountains, rivers, and skies I had never visited, but now claimed as mine. At the annual community fair, one of my paintings sold, and the organizer told me, "Your work feels like healing." That affirmation mattered more than the price. The Golden Hope Foundation became another home to me. I volunteered there several days a week, sitting with seniors who had been abandoned or exploited, listening to their stories with the empathy of someone who had walked through the same fire. Together, we filled out paperwork, challenged fraudulent signatures, and fought to restore dignity to those who had been silenced. I told them my own story, when courage failed them, showing them that even after 66 years, you can take back your life. Many cried not only for their own pain, but in relief that they weren't alone. In helping them, I felt my own wounds begin to scar over. Meanwhile, Grace and Richard's lives unraveled in ways I hadn't planned, but that came as the natural result of their own actions. They downsized into a cramped apartment far from the neighborhood where they once paraded their supposed success. Richard's prospects at work shrank, and Grace was demoted to a position where her name carried none of the trust it once did. Friends distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with scandal, and even family turned cold. The cousin who had once conspired with them cut off contact entirely, perhaps out of shame or simply self-preservation. Their marriage, people said, was cracking under the weight of blame and resentment. 6 months later, a letter arrived from Grace. I held it in my hands for days before opening it. Inside, she admitted her guilt without excuse, confessing that therapy had stripped away her justifications. She wrote that she had treated me not as a mother, but as a resource, that she finally understood the cruelty of her actions. She asked for nothing, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, only that I know she regretted it every day. I cried as I read because those were the words I had longed for years ago, when there was still a chance to mend what had been broken. But it was too late. Forgiveness came easily. I needed it for myself, but trust could not be resurrected. I replied briefly, telling her I wished her well, but that my peace lay in living apart. In my new life, forgiveness and distance coexisted. I learned that letting go of hatred didn't mean opening the door again to those who had proven they would only harm me. It meant freeing myself from the poison of bitterness, choosing joy instead of rehearsing pain. I saw Grace only once more by chance at a market. Her eyes carried exhaustion, her face etched with lines of worry. She whispered "Mom" as if it were still her right, but I shook my head gently. "I forgive you," I said, "but my life is not yours anymore." I walked away, knowing it was the truest closure I could offer. These days, mornings are mine alone. I rise with the sun, make coffee that tastes of freedom, and step onto my balcony where the garden below rustles with life. I meet friends for painting, for laughter, for dance classes, where our old bones discover rhythms we never thought we'd dare try. At the foundation, I continue to fight for those still trapped in silence, reminding them with every word it is never too late. And every evening, when I close the door to my apartment, I know that for the first time in decades, I am closing it on my own terms. The greatest lesson my life has taught me is that sacrifice without boundaries can become a prison, and love without respect is not love at all. True dignity is not in giving everything until nothing remains, but in knowing when to stand up and say enough. Family is not defined only by blood, but by the respect, care, and love that flow both ways. And freedom, even found late, is worth everything. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If my story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment to let me know where you're listening from. Your support helps me bring more stories of resilience, truth, and dignity to life.